On the Track is a web TV show about cryptozoology, natural history, green issues and whatever else the team feel like making up as they go along. Enjoy!
In the 1930s, a remote farmhouse in Cashan's Gap on the Isle of Man became the focus of weird events. Following a poltergeist outbreak, a small strange creature appeared. The Irving family, who owned the house, heard the animal speak. It claimed to be a mongoose called Jeff, who had been born in India in 1852. Jeff haunted the family for almost a decade and became world famous. He was even mentioned in the British Parliament. Although the house at Cashan's Gap was demolished in 1971, Jeff remains a Fortean icon to this day.
Hello again, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, it's me, Barry Tadcaster, back again, and this is my old mate, Jeff the Talking Mongoose. I'm an earth wonder at world, me! Thou shalt never know what I am. I already know what you are, you're a talking mongoose. Oh, that's by the by. I was born in New Delhi in 1852. Hey! Well, you've aged quite well, ain't you, mate? Oh yes. Leaving Gully just before the hour. A few more minutes won't make any difference. Not to me anyway. The early bird catches the worm. I don't want to go in tomorrow. The man will tell me off for leaving early yesterday.
Well, I'm not really sure how to describe that particular introduction.
I really like the old credits.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of On the Track. I assume that you already know, but my name's John Downs and I'm the director of an organisation called the Centre for Fortean Zoology, and I have been doing this work of national importance for very nearly 30 years now, because I came up with the idea of the Centre for Fortean Zoology whilst sitting on the shores of Loch Ness smoking an unfeasibly long cigarette back in the spring of 1992. So next April will be our 30th anniversary. I never think my ideas are going to last 5 minutes, and to have one of my ideas having last 30 years and with me now very fast approaching my dotage is really something rather cool that I had never expected was going to happen. So why, I hear you ask, should you give up half an hour on your Saturday afternoon, or whenever it is that you end up watching this show, just to hear an elderly hippie and his collection of peculiar friends and colleagues and animals talking about things that most people don't know about? And that's because most people don't know about it. And because most people consider cryptozoology and Fortean zoology, and by the way, I invented the term Fortean zoology for my sins, most people seem to believe that the term cryptozoology involves the intrepid hunt for monsters and should have absolutely no relevance whatsoever to real science and what the world actually tells us. Well, I think that's complete nonsense. So, ladies and gentlemen, the reason that I hope you're going to be watching this show from now on is that this show explains what the Centre for Fortean Zoology is doing. It follows the CFZ in its various projects around the world as they happen, and it does, I hope, prove that Fortean Zoology, cryptozoology and various other things ending with ology are part of the natural sciences. They're not the sort of third-rate hokum dreamed up by the tabloid newspapers in order to sell more copies. So, ladies and gentlemen, that is why I think you should be watching it. That is also why quite a few people in what has become the cryptozoological establishment don't think very much of us, because we insist on keeping it scientific. But while we're keeping it scientific, we also have...
Hello, I'm Ennis, and I am a very interesting chicken who lives in a little burrow behind the compost heap. And I think that when you are making sense of the very real mysteries of the world, the best way that you can do it is by consulting a make-believe chicken who plays a brown trumpet.
I like to think that I'm a reasonably good naturalist, but I am very aware that one of my besetting sins is that I treat dogs and cats as if they were little people in fur coats rather than small semi-domesticated carnivores. And this is really not a good thing to do, but I do it, I'm afraid. And I know that I really shouldn't, because trying to treat any animal, giving it a human mindset and a human set of behavioural characteristics, is just ludicrous. Dogs, for example, they're not really little people in fur coats. Archie's not really a little fellow who talks with a Birmingham accent. And Archie really is a small semi-domesticated subspecies of the grey wolf, who is fairly civilised and fairly house-trained, but he really isn't anything more or less. And the things that are important to him are not the things that are important to people. He, for example, probably spends more of his time thinking about where he can go and, as Richard Freeman so delicately puts it, lay his dog's eggs, than we in the human race do, for example. But apparently Archie, who is now complaining totally because he says that he is a little fellow who comes from Birmingham, was born behind the skips at Digbeth Coach Station, wants you to know that he has written a Christmas song.
They call him Waggy, Waggy who shits on the carpet, throws up on the mat, blames it on the cat. They call him Waggy, Waggy stays inside to pee, says the Christmas tree makes a great lavatory. They call him Waggy, Waggy stares outside, it's freezing, his anal glands need squeezing, and it's all...
Stop it, Archie, that's very, very inappropriate. What on earth would happen if Miss Maxine or Miss Charlie saw your vulgarity? I don't usually do requests,
mainly because people don't really care enough about what I talk about to make them. But on the odd occasion that somebody asks me to do something specific, I usually try to indulge them because I think it's quite a nice thing to do. And also I'm flattered enough to find out that somebody's interested enough in what I ramble on about to ask me more. On a number of occasions recently, I've alluded to the fact that nearly 20 years ago, I had an encounter with what many people like to call a British Bigfoot. Now, before we go any further, I dislike the term British Bigfoot immensely, and that's nearly all because what I saw was not an animal. It was not animate in any real sense of the word. And if Bigfoot in North America does exist, it is an unknown species of higher primate. And, now don't start with the jokes, I don't think there is any chance that there are any unknown higher primates living within 40 miles of Newcastle city centre. But first, a little bit of the backstory. As most of you probably know by now, I'm bipolar, which is what in the old days they used to call manic depressive. And I had my last very big attack on Paddington Station during the silence in respect of the people who had died in the World Trade Center attacks exactly a year before. And I collapsed, and Richard Freeman and my old mate Craig Glenday, who was, and I believe still is, the editor of the Guinness Book of Records, managed to decant me into the train that was to take us back to Exeter. And once we got back to Exeter, Richard and Graham managed to get me into the car, get me up to the house, undress me, put me to bed, and I didn't come downstairs again for the rest of the year. That was the worst attack I've ever had, and thank God my attacks have never lasted more than a week or so ever since, because 3 months of being damn near catatonic is one of the most unpleasant experiences I've ever had. However, I did have a laptop, and my laptop is what I was using to read my daily emails on. And over the last few months of 2002, over the last few months of 2002, there had been a series of encounters by various people with what people were describing as a Bigfoot-like creature. These took place in Sussex, they took place in Sherwood Forest, and most importantly, as far as this narrative is concerned, they took place in a place called Bolam Lake, which is a lake surrounded by forest about 40 miles north of Newcastle city centre. And it's a place that I have become very close to over the years because of the experiences that I had there. Now, we got Christmas out of the way, and just in case any of you who are listening don't know, Christmas is not a time of the year I like, and I'll be very glad when this one is over. It is particularly difficult, seeing as this is my second Christmas as a widower, and I don't really like it very much. So please forbear with me if I am more Scrooge-like and bar humbuggish than ever.
And yes, several of you have been kind enough to ask me questions about my encounter, and so I feel it is probably quite a good time as we approach the 19th anniversary of the occasion for me to repeat the story. Enjoy. By the time that the new year had begun, I was feeling considerably better than I had done in months. I wasn't 100% cured, but I was doing okay. And so, for reasons that I still don't really understand, I decided to take my closest colleagues within the CFZ, who at the time were Richard Freeman and Graham Inglis, and a guy called John Fuller, who worked for us, and go up to the frozen north and investigate this series of sightings of a Bigfoot-like creature which had taken place. Now, in the second week of the new year, something important happened, and it was something that I really was not expecting. A friend of mine who worked and still works for one of the larger British national newspapers gave me a tip-off, and that tip-off was that journalists from one of the more down-market British newspapers, and I can't remember for the moment whether it was the Sun or the Daily Mirror, but a journalist from one of these news-gathering organs had been involved in setting up the Bolam Lake Big Hairy Man sightings, and that if we, the Centre for Fortean Zoology, were going to go up there taking them seriously, we would quite likely find ourselves targets for ridicule in the low market press. So we decided to do what the CFZ always try to do in situations like this, and to react positively. It was time, we decided, if I may use the words from National Lampoon's Animal House, it was time for a grand and futile gesture, and the CFZ's very good at those. So we went out and bought paintballing guns, and when we set up for our journey north, we did so secure in the knowledge that we had paintballs and paintballing guns in the back of the car, and that if we were, as it was quite likely from what we've been told, if we were going to be confronted by somebody in a monkey suit jumping out from the bushes at us, we would cover them with paint, hog-tie them, and take them down and drop them on the front doorstep of the regional offices of their newspapers. Because, dear listeners, back in the early part of this century, newspapers were still powerful enough to have regional offices. And we thought that was going to be great fun. In fact, if it had worked out like that, it would have been great fun. But it didn't. And so the four of us travelled intrepidly in my old Jaguar all the way up to the frozen north, and we rendezvoused with my old mate Dave Curtis, who regular viewers of this show will be aware of. If you remember a couple of weeks ago when we were talking about the latest walrus sighting, he was the one who sang that the walrus on the Tyne was all his. But I slightly digress. In that evening, Davy Curtis took the four of us over to a wonderful working men's club called the Durden Miners Welfare Club. And these people were so sweet. I can't tell you how nice they were. And they all took us to heart and let us take over the club pretty much for the next 4 or 5 days. And it was useful that that was what happened, because we were staying in a house that was owned by Davy just across the street from the welfare club, and Davy had it up for sale, but it hadn't sold yet, so it was perfect to take over as our sort of Centre for Fortean Zoology mobile headquarters. We liaised with a local paranormal group called Avalon Skies from South Shields, and with a guy called Jeff, who was running something running something called, I believe, from memory, it was called British Hominid Research. I haven't heard from Jeff in many, many, many years, and I think that he didn't like the way that we did our thing, but hey, that's the way it goes. We do what we believe is to be the best, and if people don't like what we do, then I'm afraid they can like it or they can lump it. But with Jeff and some of the guys from the Avalon Skies Research Group in South Shields, we went to recce the location and to meet the first of our witnesses. And over the next few days we met a whole bunch of people who'd seen the Bigfoot in the woods surrounding Bolam Lake, and what soon became very, very clear was that what they had seen was not a pesky newspaper reporter in a monkey suit just about to jump out at them. It was something very real and really quite scary. We heard nothing more about the story of the rogue newspaper reporter, and the paintball guns stayed wrapped up in the back of my car, and I flogged them on eBay a few weeks later when we returned to Exeter. But what I want to do now is to tell you what happened on the third day we were here. Okay, at the time we had very little money. By we I mean not just us individually, but the Centre for Fortean Zoology. And so when the BBC phoned me up and said would I give them an interview about the Bolam Lake creature, and I would say always creature in inverted commas, but I don't want to disturb this little creature, so please forgive me for not being totally consistent. They wanted to talk to me about the Bolam Lake creature, and they were generous enough to say they'd give me 50 quid for doing it. Well, this was nearly 20 years ago, and 50 quid was a hell of a lot more money than it is now. So, yes, I said, of course I'll do it. And then came the bad news. They wanted me to be up at Bolam Lake at some god-awful hour of the morning, because they wanted me there in time to go out live on the Radio 4 Today show. And this, through happenstance, was just about at the time of dawn. So, luckily, they sent a rather palatial, if you can have a palatial taxi cab. It wasn't quite a limo, but it was much better than your average taxi cab, to come and collect me. And the guy who came to collect me was a very jolly fellow who was quite happy for me to smoke in his cab, and with mild embarrassment I remember that I used to smoke quite a lot back in those days. But memo to you guys, I stopped smoking about 5 years ago. And trust me, once you've seen your wife, who you love very much, dying slowly of lung cancer, you're never going to start again. But I puffed away on my trusty Benson Hedges merrily as we travelled all the way from Sea to Bolam Lake, and we got there about 20 minutes before dawn, and we got greeted by this very, very, very earnest-looking fellow from the BBC Today programme, and he had a small car, one of those cars that were made in the late 90s and the early 2000s and all looked exactly the same. And he had one of these things and was unpacking a load of Heath Robinson-looking equipment out of the back, and he had what appeared to be satellite dishes gaffer taped to the roof of the car. And so I went over to him, I made my introductions, and then I went back to join my friend the taxi driver, and we sat on the bonnet of his car, smoking jollily away and waiting for something to happen. And then, believe me, something did. I expect that most of you will probably have heard an album called Dark Side of the Moon by Pink Floyd, and you will be aware of the massively over-amplified heartbeats that are at the beginning of side one. I've been listening to that album on and off for well over 40 years, but I never thought I would hear massively over-amplified heartbeats or something that sounded very much like that booming from out of the woods in the middle of the winter in Northumberland. But that's what happened. And then something even stranger happened. The birds, who had been squawking away, I don't think you can call it a dawn chorus if it's a bunch of rooks and crows in a rookery, but they were squawking away, then they suddenly went quiet, and the booming heartbeat sounds continued. I was really quite shocked by this. I didn't know what to make of it, and my first idea, and I checked what my mate the taxi driver thought, and he agreed, was that this was something to do with the very Heath Robinson collection of satellite dishes which were gaffer taped to the roof of the BBC bloke's little car. The booming heartbeat stopped, and the birds started to squawk again, and I went over and I had a brief word with the BBC guy and asked him if that had been anything to do with him, and he denied it, doing whatever the educated version of "not to do with me, Gov" would have been, and within a few minutes told me that the BBC guys back at Broadcasting House were ready to interview me. So they interviewed me. It all went reasonably well. I got back in the car, a bit pissed off the fact that I had to invoice them to get the 50 quid. And by the way, guys, it took me something like 5 months to get that 50 quid, and so I never did get it in time to be able to bolster up expedition funds. And my mate the taxi driver, still chain smoking heavily, took me all the way back to see him on sea, where my colleagues were just getting up. And yes, we did have a jolly breakfast. I still ate meat in those days, and so there was bacon and sausages for all, and we made ready for our expedition of the day. Traditionally, ghost stories have been a part of Christmas, and so I think it's quite good that I'm telling this story, which is totally true, by the way. It's quite good, I think, that I'm telling this story this Yuletide. As any of you who's not got a paper bag over your head completely will have noticed, this was filmed over several different days. This was because I'm still feeling monumentally shagged out after my unpleasant cold. And despite all the ways that I have tried to keep the continuity, I think the word is, the continuity going, the fact that Lilith is in some shots and not in others really does give the game away. But I am going to be back in the next episode, probably with Lilith, to tell you the next part of the story. Whether or not we will finish it next episode remains to be seen. It's all in the lap of the gods, or in the lap of the cats, as it turns out, and we'll have to wait and see how it goes.
If you want to support us and help us make more content like these, please press like, subscribe, follow our Facebook page and check out our Patreon.
And as the ghost of Joe Strummer, who's an ever more regular visitor to my little studio, wants me to remind you, always press the notification bell. Otherwise you won't be told when there's a new show to watch.
And that would be an awful pity, wouldn't it?
And so, ladies and gentlemen, here we are at the end of another episode. And this has been the last episode before what is euphemistically called the festive season. We will be back on Christmas Day. Whether or not there'll be anyone to see us or not, I don't know. But we will be back. And so, if you are there, we'll be there. And me and Lilith, at least, will be seeing you.